Hey folks, welcome. We're going to give people a little bit of time to join us, about a minute or so. But in the meantime, welcome to Decarceration for All. My name is Carlos. I've been hosting these events with Uncommon Law. And while we're giving folks some time to join us, in the chat box, let us know who you are. What's your name? What are your pronouns? And what brought you here? Do you have any questions for the panelists? We will be having a Q&A at the end, and they will be answering audience questions. Welcome, Sanja. We have a social worker joining us today. That's great. And the mix of our audience is very activists, lawyers and activists, which is really great to see folks working together. Welcome, Mary Lou. Thank you for joining us. And we'll get started shortly, but like I just said, let us know who you are. We really want to build community in these spaces, so find your people. What's your name? What are your pronouns? And why are you here? What questions brought you here? And what do you hope to learn from our panelists today? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Folks are going to be trickling in, but let's start with our program for today. So welcome to Decarceration for All. This is our third and final part in our special event series between ChangeLawyers and Uncommon Law. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carlos. I use he and they pronouns, and I am the content director at ChangeLawyers. ChangeLawyers is my organization, and what we do is that we are a foundation and we fund the next generation of BIPOC lawyers. Now, before we begin and I introduce our panelists, I do want to sort of acknowledge the kind of surreal and very mixed emotional month we've all had. When we first started this event series back in April, it was the exact same day that the Derek Chauvin conviction was announced. And now, as we're ending this event series, we're finally being able to imagine a post-COVID world where we can see our families and friends with a little less anxiety and stress. So it's highs and lows every day, and it feels very surreal. So I just want to acknowledge that for the room, and acknowledge that folks who are listening in today are probably feeling the same way. And so I'm grateful for you all being here today. I'm grateful that we get to show up for each other, that we get to talk, that we get to sort of heal through community, and that we get to build our power together. And so with this in mind, I just want to set a tone for the next hour. All of the spaces that we host, we very much value emotions and honesty and vulnerability, and we really center all of our conversations around identity. Now, today's conversation in particular is going to be centering the identities of BIPOC folks who are disproportionately overrepresented in the criminal justice system and are overrepresented in incarceration. So keep that in mind. If you are not BIPOC, please be aware of that and about how much space you take up in the comments section. But with that in mind, please also share about yourself in the comments section. Let us know if you have any questions for the panelists. We will be having a Q&A at the end. So with that, I want to start introducing our folks today, starting off with Keith. Keith has been hosting these events from the beginning. He's the founder and executive director of Uncommon Law, and he's been doing this work for 20 years. And in particular, Keith has, in addition to all the great work he's done, he's had a lot of really great accomplishments, and he's been recognized for this work. He is one of the Obama Foundation's inaugural fellows in 2018. And in 2020, he was awarded the James Irvine's Foundation's Leadership Award. So welcome once again, Keith. It's so great to have you here.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you. Thanks for getting us together yet again.
We have a lot more to talk about based on how the last two have gone.
Indeed. Yes, we do.
I also want to introduce Romarilyn, who is the program director at Project Rebound at Cal State University Fullerton. Project Rebound supports the higher education and successful integration of formerly incarcerated folks. Romerylin is a Black feminist, a prison abolitionist scholar, working to interrupt the criminalization at the intersections of race, gender, and education. Thank you so much for being here, Romerylin. I, in particular, really value your perspective.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And finally, I want to introduce Danielle, the founder and executive director of Common Justice. Common Justice develops and advances practical and groundbreaking solutions to violence that do not rely on incarceration, which we don't hear enough about. So I really want to hear more about that. And I've gotten a couple questions throughout the week about that. What are the alternatives to incarceration? Danielle has been featured in many various conferences and publications, including the Aspen's Ideas Festival, the Atlantic Magazine Summit on Race and Justice. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and is also the author of many books, including The Other Side of Harm, Addressing Disparities in Our Responses to Violence. Thank you for being here, Danielle.
Danielle's, there we go. She was muted for a second.
Thank you all so much. It's great to be with you.
All right, Keith, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you for joining me in this conversation. I've been looking forward to this. We're going to talk about violence and our responses to it and ways to prevent it. You know, in California, we have about 76% of the people in our prisons are there for serious and violent crimes. It's one of those inconvenient truths that in order to eliminate what we refer to as mass incarceration, we can't simply focus on the non-serious, non-violent crimes. You know, we have a preference really to focus on drug crimes, for example. But we actually have to develop some different ways to prevent and respond to violence. And we'll need to develop some safe pathways for those folks to come home from their long prison sentences. We have about, in California, a third of the people in our prisons, and nationwide, more than 200,000 people are serving life sentences. And they're overwhelmingly Black and brown folks, about 2/3. And today we're going to talk about what folks need to know about some of the people serving such sentences and the circumstances that contributed to those sentences. And we'll also explore the question of whether we're really ready to tell the truth about alternatives to incarceration for those convicted of serious and violent crimes. We also want to spend some time discussing the particularly harsh impact of our current system on women, you know, a group that has experienced a 700% increase in incarceration rates over the past 40 years or so. What can their stories tell us about how inadequate and even harmful our responses to violence currently are? I'm really honored to be joined by Romerylin Ralston, whom I've always known as a strong and vocal advocate for currently and formerly incarcerated people, providing really valuable insights into the experiences of incarcerated women, and also working hard to improve opportunities for education and employment for folks after their release, and she's certainly doing that in her current role at Cal State Fullerton. And Danielle Sered, you know, you've written and spoken extensively about violence and our responses to it. And when I picked up your book, Until We Reckon, I was struck by how eloquently you put into words and thoughtful analysis many of the things that I was seeing and experiencing in my own work with people serving life sentences. But I'd often struggled to understand it within a broader social and historical context, and you definitely provided that for me. I want to start with Romerylin, if that's okay. We first met during an event that we call Lifer School, which is something that we've been doing for a number of years at Uncommon Law. We were partnering with University of Southern California's law school. It's our effort to train other attorneys and advocates and family members on how to navigate California's discretionary parole process, which currently holds 35,000 people. And for what I heard, Romarilyn, from your story back then, and I know you've seen the power of personal transformation, particularly through education for those who are incarcerated. But along the way, I'm sure you've also seen plenty of people whose motivations and actions never should have resulted in incarceration. So I'm curious to hear from you what kinds of stories contradict those most common narratives about women convicted of serious and violent crimes in particular.
Well, thank you, Keith. Yeah, it was quite a while ago when we met at Life of School, but I'd heard so many wonderful things about you from the women at CIW, where I spent 23 years. So I kind of felt like I knew a little bit about you before we met. And thank you for the question. It's a really great question. When it comes to incarcerated women and those serving life sentences and life without the possibility of parole, what we found in a lot of our research is that women who commit violence or at least charged with violence are oftentimes not the perpetrator of a crime. They have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole or life because they had information after the fact, or they were in a car or some other situations. And many times women don't know what to do. Because 90% of women who are incarcerated have experienced years of sexual trauma, years of violence and abuse from an intimate partner. So oftentimes women are found guilty and sentenced to life in prison when they really haven't done anything to be sentenced to that amount of time, but be in a relationship with someone. And unfortunately, our court system is not structured in a way that understands intimate partner violence, sexual trauma, or even understand women and how we present ourselves when we're under extreme amounts of stress because of incarceration and the way that we are incarcerated. Well, I think that's one thing. And what I've seen, in my years of incarceration and even after incarceration, was that a lot of women who do commit violence, it's after years, again, of being abused or they're protecting their children. They're protecting, the most precious things that they have. And, it's just unfortunate that women are treated the same as men or worse when it comes to being sentenced to life. Currently, California has over 40,000 life prisoners. And those who are serving life without the possibility of parole generally come in, at age 19. So at age 19, you can't expect a 19-year-old person, or anyone for that matter, to understand the ramifications of their actions. And so just looking at some of those facts, I think we need to take a closer look at why we sentence people to long sentences.
Thank you. Definitely agree with that. I'm glad you brought up the issue of trauma. It's something we've talked about in previous webinars and a lot of other events. It comes up in our work all the time, and we're definitely going to come back to that during this conversation. And I have a question for Danielle. In our work at Uncommon Law, we are unapologetic about the fact that most of our clients committed murder, and we're committed to rehumanizing them and helping them be understood at a level that labeling them as murderers can never accomplish. So, the question for you is, why is it so important that we push back against this distinction between violent and nonviolent crimes in our policymaking.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here with you, Keith and Romarilyn and Carlos. Thank you for convening us, and for everyone who's joined. I mean, I think it's first important before talking about that distinction to own the fact that that distinction is one of our own making. And by our own making, I mean the movement to end mass incarceration, that we collectively, not all of us, but the majority, judged that the way we would win reforms for nonviolent crime would be by elevating and centering the distinction between the people who committed those crimes and other people. And that we would say, you know, these are not the dangerous ones. Do not put them in prison where they will be near the truly dangerous ones and be made worse by it. And that narrative that we are up against that is so difficult to overcome is not only our opposition's narrative. Until very recently, it has been completely the dominant narrative of our own side, and even now still persists in a ton of the framing we see for really critical reforms. Those reforms, I truly believe, can win without throwing anyone under the bus. That you can say someone does not belong in prison without having to say that someone else does. That we can talk affirmatively about why juveniles should not be incarcerated without saying anything about why adults should. And so I think it's really important as we think through this distinction that we take ownership and responsibility for the ways in which our own movement has centered and elevated it, because I think accountability matters. To your question more specifically, though, I think the first reason that the violent versus nonviolent dichotomy is problematic is to your point in the opening, which is that we will not end mass incarceration if we do not take on the question of violence. When more than half of people in the country are locked up for crimes of violence, there is no path to a transformative reduction in our use of prison that avoids the question of violence. And so to talk about disliking prison, wanting to see mass incarceration and understanding it as a key civil rights issue of our time, if we avoid violence in that conversation, we aren't speaking truthfully. By my best estimates, on the day I was born, there were 443,850 people locked up in the US. I would ask any data scientists on the call not to calculate my age exactly. And so even when we say there are 2.3 million people now, so even when we say reduce incarceration by half, we're conceding a threefold increase in our own lifetimes. It's too much. So the ambition of the scale we should be aspiring to is far, far greater. Like the vision we should have is not just about what we can imagine, but even just what we can remember from the 70s, right? It doesn't require some brand new world. Like we have lived in a world with less incarceration. We can return to it through policy decisions. And we will not do that if those decisions don't include violence. But the second thing that I think gets lost in this is that just as we can't end mass incarceration without addressing violence, we cannot end violence without ending mass incarceration. And I think we often talk about incarceration as something that is effective, but really painful for people, or that is ineffective. And that's sort of where the debate lives. But I actually think it's far worse than that. I think incarceration is productive of violence. And so at the end of the day, I'm someone who's in the business of eradicating violence. And so if you're trying to eradicate something, the thing you do is you look for what produces it and you try and get rid of that thing. Like if there's a smell in your house, you look for the thing that smells and you throw that thing away. And in our culture, I think it is impossible to honestly assess where violence comes from and not land at the answer that incarceration is one of the core culprits. So first, like the core drivers of violence are structural. They are things like poverty, inequity, the lack of a basic social service infrastructure, all of the things that support like basic human needs being met and people's well-being. And those things in this country are and have always been highly racialized. The access to those basic human supports have always been distributed along lines of race. And so those structural drivers are the fundamental causes of violence. And those are always continually reinforced by incarceration in the way it diminishes communities' ability to command living wages, to produce their own safety, to reconcile with one another, to learn from one another, to raise their own families, all of those things. But at the same time, even on the individual level, so even aside from that structural construct, the context, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs on the individual level. Core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so we've baked into our core response to violence exactly the things that generate it. Like, I've compared it to showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. Like, we are not honest if we act surprised when the flames flare higher based on our response. And so I don't actually believe you have to hate prison to want to end prison. I believe the only thing you have to hate to want to end prison is violence.
Thank you for that. It's powerful stuff and a lot to think about. I always, beginning of a conversation like this, wish we had like 4 hours longer than we actually have, because there's so much to unpack there and try to address. I would ask Romerlin if you have any additional observations about why it's important that we reject this distinction between violent and nonviolent. And I have another question for you after that.
Thank you, Keith. Well said, Danielle. Well said. Thank you so much for that. And just add that, besides the dichotomy between violent and nonviolent, we set up that one group of people are more deserving than another group of people. And, with our current laws and enhancements that we have currently in California, folks get sentenced to a ridiculous amount of time. And folks look at that amount of time because they don't really know the whole story and think that a person is deserving of being put in that cage, that cell, where they can, as you said, Danielle, be exposed to more violence. Are you deserving of that? Because you steal a loaf of bread, or you steal $25 or $50 or $100 worth of merchandise to feed your family. You're not deserving of that. So I think we need to look at this dichotomy of violence versus nonviolent and really unpack, why people, as you said, Danielle, commit, violent acts. But also, I think we need to redefine what violence is within our penal code and within our communities, and have more support in our communities so that folks are not engaging in, economic and poverty crimes. And so if we had more support, if we could divest some of those funds, from corrections, from law enforcement, and reinvest those funds and reimagine what our communities can look like so that everyone is safe and thriving and fed and housed, we could just make our communities a better place. So I just add that.
Thank you. Thanks for that. The other question I want to ask you about relates to what Carlos said we'd be talking about, at the top, and that is the racial dynamics that exist and all the disparities that we see at every other stage in our criminal legal process. We see it certainly in prison, and our focus in our work is the discretionary parole process. The end, presumably for those who are eligible for parole, it's supposed to be the end of their incarceration, where we see race playing a major factor in determining whether someone's released there as well. There are not enough studies. There's not much out there that analyzes racial disparities or patterns in discretionary parole decisions. But the few that exist confirm that, for example, in California, Black people are less likely to be granted parole in California, discretionary parole decisions, than whites. They're about 3 times less likely to be granted. The question for you, Romerlin, is how have you personally seen racism and white supremacy play out in California's parole process?
Well, I think we see it play out just by the makeup of the parole board. The majority of the parole board, the commissioners, deputy commissioners, are white. They're coming from law enforcement backgrounds, policing, judges, things like that. Even sometimes our attorneys who are representing us that are state appointed or white, the district attorneys that are opposing our release or white. So when you talk about, white supremacy being played out in the parole board hearing, it's an extension of the criminal punishment system. These people have been trained early on in their careers to look at race and to criminalize certain ethnicity groups. And so as retired individuals who have this training, who had practiced this training for many years prior to becoming a part of the parole board, they do what they know. And so when we walk into those hearing rooms as Black people or brown people, there's just an automatic, I think, response from commissioners to continue to criminalize the color of our skin. So as you started out this conversation, Keith, we're talking about 76% of the people in California are doing time for serious or violent crimes. Most of the people incarcerated here in California are disproportionately Black and brown. Black men in California are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man. So the parole board, again, is just an extension of what we see happening in our communities with over-policing, over-sentencing, and disproportionately locking up people of color.
For sure. And you talked about the parole board makeup itself. And you're right that overwhelmingly the commissioners come from law enforcement backgrounds. And what we are finding in our analysis of parole hearing outcomes and patterns is that regardless of the race of the commissioner, Black people are less likely to be granted parole, more likely to be seen as still dangerous and a violent risk many years, decades after their incarceration. So Danielle, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this. What kind of role you see race play in policy decisions and practices when it comes to our responses to violence?
I mean, I think, I echo everything Marilyn said and would just be a little more direct and just say this system has always been about race. Mass incarceration is the grandchild of slavery. We see it's morphing into quote unquote convict leasing. The moment we see the end of slavery, we see the establishment of a process whereby Black and brown people can be criminalized for basic day-to-day activities, and then their freedom turned back into currency for somebody else, sold back, working off to repurchase their freedom that they had earned through through emancipation and through their basic human dignity that had always been theirs. And so the continuity of that practice in this country is unbroken. And I think it's really important that we understand it always in its historical context. And so, of course, there are disparities at every single stage. There are disparities at arrest, at what someone is charged with, at how bail is set, at what pleas are offered, at what people are sentenced to, at whether they are granted parole, at the terms of that parole, when that parole is revoked or not. I mean, all of it at every point, over and over again, there are demonstrable disparities at every point with every decision maker. And so when we accept that system as a whole, we accept a system that we know fundamentally is one that is inflicting punishment on Black and brown people in a way completely disproportionate to the way that it is treating white people. And I understand that now through all of this data, but I came to understand it as a beneficiary of that system. As a young person, I got in a lot of trouble, in part because of the traumatic experiences that I went through, and in part because I was an adolescent, and adolescents are stupid. And I did things I shouldn't have. And I was met with a great deal of mercy in that system when the young Black man with whom I got in the most trouble with was met with the exact opposite. And in that experience, it taught me very clearly the way in which that system is racialized, the way in which it is unfair. I understood personally that it would be my job to find people who were fighting that inequity and join them in that fight and do that until we won or I died, whichever came first. But I also understood something that I didn't know what to do with until much later, which was that it revealed how much discretion those system actors have. we were not charged with different charges, right? Prosecutors could end mass incarceration tomorrow if they wanted to. They can always go down to a lesser charge if they choose to. And so those actors have an enormous amount of discretion and built-in practices to choose safety, to choose empathy, to choose mercy, to choose pragmatism over punishment. And I think it goes back to your question about the violent and nonviolent binary or dichotomy, because I think that's not only a practical question, like it is also a narrative question. And Marilyn, you talked about this at the beginning too, that we have this story about who people are who commit violence that is so fully dehumanized. And that story is totally racialized and always has been. And so unless we come for the roots of that story, like it will be like, I'm not actually great at growing plants. I wanted to ask Carlos. I saw the plants in his background. They were very impressive. So I private chat him about that. But what I do know from people who are good at growing plants is that it involves a lot of trimming the edges and watering the roots. And I think when we do work around reforming, like small incremental reforms for nonviolent crime, where we don't come at that fundamental racialized narrative, we're trimming the edges. And meanwhile, like off the side of our waste, our water cans are spilling into the ground with all of these stories about some imagined monstrous other, like nourishing that tree that will continue and continue to grow. And so I think our directness and our steering into that through the question of race, through the question of violence is critical to anything we're going to win, and critical, honestly, to the durability even of those incremental reforms for nonviolent crime. And the last thing I would say about this is that I think that racialized narrative is not just about people who cause harm. And this is to Marilyn's point. It's not just who do we see as a monster, it's who can we see as a survivor. You know, like victim service posters are almost always faces of women like me. And I am a survivor of rape. I have buried people I love to murder. And still I know that a young Black man is 10 times more likely than me to be robbed or assaulted. A Black woman is 5 times as likely as I am to experience sexual violence. Like, I am not the poster child. And if we norm policies around what people presume I would want, then we are going to norm them to something that continually erases the survivorship of Black and brown people. And we see this in part, like if you look at the disparities in the death penalty, there are grave disparities in the application of the death penalty, where Black people are far more likely than white people to be executed or sentenced to death, both. But there are also enormous disparities if you look at the victims of those crimes, that no one is sentenced to death for hurting Black and brown people. It is not my point that people should be, but is my point that our devaluation of Black and brown lives extends to everywhere the system meets with them, including when they are the people who are harmed. And so I think we have a fundamental question in this country, which is like whether we want to be a democracy or not, like whether we want the full citizenship of all of our people or not. I think it is a question that has like always been open for this nation and never yet answered, at least not in the affirmative. And I think mass incarceration is one of the places where that question comes like most squarely into our attention and where we're called to answer in a way we never have before.
Well, Danny, I love the story you shared about you being, you know, not a straight and narrow, you know, adolescent, that you got into some trouble, and that the Black man who you were with, you know, also got into trouble. But, you know, just how you described yourself as an adolescent and, you know, your counterpart as a Black man, so does the criminal legal punishment system. You know, Black people, we don't get to be adolescents. We don't get to be children. You know, we are handcuffed at 5 years old, you know, and put in the back of police cars. And so, you know, there's this built-in biasness, you know, even and violence that we experience even as young Black children being criminalized by the system. So we never, ever are treated as fully human beings from the time that we are born. You know, we're always subjected to a punishment, and severe punishment, regardless of our gender, regardless of our age, regardless of our economic situation. You know, those who have more money than they need or still pulled over because they're driving while Black or driving a nice car. So the whole system, all of America, all of its functions are built in white supremacy and institutionalized racism. So we have to change everything, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, about everything in order for Black people to be treated fairly, to be treated with equity, to be treated as human beings. We have to change everything.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, these racialized policies and narratives are usually they're cloaked in these sort of trappings and hidden behind these labels that sound like tough on crime and zero tolerance. And what's interesting, and we should, as we talk about people who are victimized by violence, people who are survivors of violence, we don't hear a lot of calls from them directly saying we want more prisons and more people to be in prison. We hear people who claim to be speaking for them, from the prosecutor's office, from elected officials, who say the response is we need more police to protect victims. And I mean, never mind for a second the fact that people are excluding from being recognized as survivors the people who are in prison. We talked about trauma earlier, but I guess one of the things, Danielle, you've cited some studies, and I think some that you all have conducted, finding that survivors of violence prefer a response other than incarceration for the people who cause them harm. So how should we understand this preference for something other than incarceration, and what should it teach us about what those non-carceral responses could look like?
So the organization I direct in New York City runs what is still the first and only alternative to incarceration for serious and violent felonies in the adult system in America. And so in cases like stabbings and shootings and gunpoint robberies, if the prosecutor and the victim of crime both agree, these cases are diverted into a process where, after extensive preparation and intensive violence intervention curriculum, the people who caused harm sit down in a restorative justice process with those they hurt, acknowledge the harm, reach agreements about how they can make things as right as possible, and begin the course of completing those agreements. They do that over the next year, and if they fulfill those agreements and make it through our violence intervention curriculum, which nearly all of them do, they don't go to prison, and the felony charges against them are dismissed. And in the meantime, we work with the people who hurt them to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And so when you ask about our studies are not like a poll. What we do is we go to, so it's important to remember, fewer than half of victims don't call the police in the first place. So shame on us if we pretend that the criminal justice system is survivor-centered. Like 50% when I was in school was an F. Like we're starting from half of people preferring nothing to everything that system has on offer. Another half of those people will drop out before grand jury. So they'll engage the police, but they will not engage the court process. And so 75% of survivors have already said they want either nothing or something else, but not this. That remaining quarter are arguably the jailingest subset of victims you'll find. And they're the people we go to because we're post-indictment. And we say, do you want common justice or do you want incarceration for the person who hurt you? And 90% of them choose common justice. 90%. It is a wild number. And when we first saw it, I sort of thought people were better than I knew, that we believed in mercy and forgiveness and thought, but for the grace of God, go I. And I think some of us do. But the rest of those were for things I shouldn't have known as a survivor myself. And the best way I have been able to describe this is that as survivors, we will found that we would like bring out our bones to be free of it from the marrow there. And we will feel fear so intrusive that in our own homes, in the safety of the arms of the people we love most, we will be unable to sleep. And when sleep finally takes us, we will wake from that sleep with nightmares. And we will feel rage so all-consuming, it makes us unrecognizable, like even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, we are pragmatic. There are two things we can't stand. We cannot stand the idea of going through it again. and we cannot stand the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And so if we're given a choice, we choose the thing that we think will prevent those things we cannot stand. And the hardest people to persuade that incarceration will do that are anybody who has lived in a neighborhood where incarceration is common. Like, we have paid, survivors have paid the price of prison's failure with their enduring pain. No country in human history has locked up as many of its own people as we do. If incarceration produced safety, we would be the safest nation ever to have existed. And the neighborhoods where incarceration is common, the Black and brown neighborhoods where there are rates unprecedented ever for as long as humans have lived, would be the safest places that we could ever imagine creating. That is just not the case. Prison doesn't work. And people who live with the effects of that failure know it. And so when survivors choose alternatives to incarceration over prison, it is not typically or even mostly because they are merciful, and it is not typically or mostly because they care about the person who hurt them at that moment. It is typically and mostly because they care about themselves, because they want to be safe. They want others to be safe, and they want to choose something that will produce that safety. And so I think it's really important we understand that deciding to break our reliance on incarceration to address violence doesn't actually require mercy. Like, it requires pragmatism. Like, it requires that we want to be safe. And sometimes I think, like, the question that we don't ask enough is, do we want to punish violence or do we want to end violence? And what do we do if those two goals are incompatible? For me, I want to end violence. And even if I liked punishment, if ending violence meant giving up punishment, I would choose it over and over and over again every single time.
Thank you for that. You know, it obviously this ties directly into comments you made earlier, Romarilyn, about the experience of survivors. Although we don't always recognize people who are incarcerated as survivors, as we said, but you talked about how 90% of people in women's prisons in particular are survivors of physical, emotional, or sexual trauma long before their actions may have harmed others or led to prison. I think we all agree prison doesn't work. Prison only leads to much more violence and harm. But I do know that we have seen pockets. We've seen some instances where people have managed to heal from, transform these trauma histories, either through formal therapeutic programs or self-help programs inside the prison, or through more informal support structures. And I wonder if you have any observations you can share now about how you've seen that exist, you know, against all the odds and all the violence producing aspects of the prison environment, how you've seen people overcome that to transform their own lives and their relationship to their own trauma histories.
That's a great question. And I lived it, you know, inside the prison, you know, as a survivor myself, you know, attending group therapy, being part of self-help programs like Convicted Women Against Abuse, where we get to talk about our trauma histories and support one another. But what I've noticed and experienced with inside California Institution for Women is that when women get together and they support one another and understand trauma, understand their own vulnerabilities and what led to their incarceration, and you know what they want to do now with their lives after losing their children, losing their homes, losing their freedom. You know, when we come together as a community of survivors and support one another and love each other back to health, because we understand the plight of the sister or the other, you know, then we heal, because we don't feel alone. We don't feel isolated. You talked about shame. You know, we don't feel the shame of being now in that prison and have lost everything, because we have a community that's loving us back to health. And that's what I experienced in the prison, because we realized that our survival depends on each other. And when we get to that place of healing and cooperation and love and care for one another, then we see people start to become their best self, reinvent themselves, even within a cage.
Mm.
You know, we are humanized within our community of care because we've been dehumanized through all of those years of violence and trauma that we experienced prior to prison, and then while being incarcerated. And so when we get together and we're able to support one another and love one another through the pain and heal and have that care, then we're able to become the thing that we never were when we were on the outside. And that's a fully recognized human being who has experienced love. A lot of us didn't come from loving families or community, but we can find that sometimes in the worst place on earth. And it's not because of the prison. The prison is debilitating. The prison does not rehabilitate. The prison punishes. But the people inside who come from the same lived experience, the same background, who understand what the next person has gone through, we can love each other back to health. And that's to your point, Danielle. None of us as survivors want to see another person punished, another person go through what we've been through, because we know that the criminal legal punishment system is a violent place and it does not heal. And so we know what it takes for people to become better, and that's opportunities to be loved.
Thank you. You know, as I said at the outset, you know, we this is really many hours of conversation, and just to start. But I did promise Carlos we would give the audience an opportunity to have their questions presented to you folks. So, Carlos, you got any?
Y'all should see the comment section. It is has been very active since the beginning, and a lot of support for everything that you all are saying. But one thing that sort of keeps coming up in different versions is this idea that everyone who is incarcerated should have a pathway home, including people convicted for violent offenses. That's still, like, a lot of people are trying to wrap their head around that. I think, Danielle, you said it earlier, like it's part of the messaging. We've just never really been exposed to this. And so there's a lot of questions similar to the following. So if not incarceration, then what? Because I think that there's, especially the ChangeLawyers audience, is a lot of lawyers, right? A lot of career lawyers. What can you all offer outside of mass incarceration for violent offenses?
And so it's all we do at Common Justice, right? I mean, we do organizing communication work around it, but it's like I believe profoundly in restorative justice. I think it's really important we understand that punishment and accountability are not the same thing. You know, to Marilyn's point, punishment is passive. It's something somebody does to you. Accountability is different. Accountability requires that someone acknowledge what they did, acknowledge its impact, express genuine remorse, make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and become someone who will never cause that harm ever again. The very structure of prison is antithetical to that. Like, it interrupts the basic human connection. It interrupts people's ability to make repair. It interrupts people's ability to change. Like, runs contrary to accountability in our culture. And so the development of alternatives to incarceration that have restorative justice at their heart, I think, are particularly compelling for violence, because there are a lot of things people do that they're incarcerated for that maybe we should just leave them alone. You know, like, maybe it's not really the state's business or any of our business why somebody did it, why they did it. Maybe that should be worked out just like between and among family and neighbors in a really simple way. With violence, I think we are obligated collectively to address it, right? That we can't say, like, this behavior is fine, never mind. Like, this person robbed you, never mind, let it go. That doesn't honor the person who was hurt. And so I think we need solutions that don't require that we excuse violence, that don't require that we pretend that violence is always justifiable whenever it is done. Like, there are people who do things they should not do to other people, hands down, things people have no right to do to another human. And that harm is reparable. And the person who caused it is in possession of their full human dignity. And the person who caused it can contribute to the repair that is required. And so for me, it is not reducing. The answer is not in reducing the impact on a survivor and not saying it wasn't such a big deal. The answer is saying it is a big deal, and therefore, what does that survivor deserve? And I think, like, our criminal justice system, the best way I can describe it is like if someone burned down your house and the criminal justice system came to help, all it could do is burn down their house in your name. What we ask is, like, what would it look like to build you somewhere you could live? And what would it look like to ask of the person who burned down your house, not to themselves burn, not to themselves be rendered homeless, but to build you somewhere you could live? And that question is one that I think when we answer points us to completely different solutions. And they are solutions that not only don't require, but don't allow for the degradation of people who commit harm, but they are also solutions that contribute to the healing and mending and repair of the people who were hurt. And when those are the options we're putting forward, we don't have to worry as much about our great talking points because they make sense, because they give people what they need. And so I think one of the things that's really important is that we are engaged in the labor, not just of tearing down what we don't want, but of building what we do want. And one of my mentors growing up in Chicago used to say, it's hard to get people excited to fight for a shit sandwich, easy on the shit. And I think very often that's what we're doing, right? We want LWOP instead of the death penalty. We want a misdemeanor instead of felony. We want 20-year max instead of 35. And all those things are critical. Like, every single day of any human being's freedom is of extraordinary value. And if all I secured in my decades of work was one day of someone else being free, I would feel that it had been worth it at the end. And at the same time, I believe that we can fight not just to have less of what we hate, less of what causes harm, and that we can fight to have more of what we want. Like, we can fight not for, I mean, of course, like, if I'm eating a shit sandwich, I want the lightest spread possible. Like, I get it, no doubt. But what if we were fighting at least for a peanut butter and jelly? And could we start to envision fighting for a meal that nourished us? Like a meal that maybe even had enough extra that we could bring some home to the people we loved. Like, what does it look like for us to fight for that? And what I find is that when we are not just saying less prison, less this, less that, but saying more of this other thing, the range and number of people who can support it and who will support it enthusiastically and take their tired selves out of their homes after a long day of work to fight alongside for it goes through the roof. Like Alan Jenkins used to always say that there's a reason Dr. King's most famous speech isn't called "I Have a Complaint." Like, that we respond to affirmative vision. And I think a lot of what we're called to in this moment, and so much of what we see of the young organizers who are, I believe, leading the way for all of us, is the labor not just of tearing down, but of building up.
Thanks for that, Danielle. You know, really, I think the next show has to be exploring ways to take the best aspects of your model and spread it to so many other jurisdictions that are demanding something different, but for whatever reason lack the imagination or political will to make it happen. Thanks, Carlos. Any other questions?
Yeah. So Danielle, you kind of like answered this a little bit already, but a lot of the questions were about how do you sell this concept to a wider audience, and I think you answered that with sort of affirmative responses rather than things that we want, that we don't want to see. I'm going to give some space, because a lot of the questions are about this, to Romarilyn or Keith to also offer ways to sell this idea to a wider audience.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to what Danielle said. You know, we have to transform harm, and in order to do that, you know, we have to show people, teach people, give people other opportunities. You know, The folks who are being over-policed, the Black and brown communities that are being over-policed, also have, neighborhoods that are flooded with businesses and lifestyles that don't produce a healthy environment. We need to look at our school systems, look at the amount of liquor stores that are in our communities and fast food businesses, and nourish our children so that they don't grow up in environments that are continuing to harm them from birth. And so when you are robbing children from nutrition and robbing them from a quality education where there's no parks and ducks and ponds in their neighborhood, and all they see and grow up in and is surrounded by is concrete and police cars and violence, then we are producing, folks who are going to cause harm or be harmed. So we need to produce something else. We need to transform our communities and environments, which means investing in our communities and environments and transforming our neighborhoods. We don't need to be over-policed if we have nice parks and good education systems and after-school programs and community gardens and urban gardens and all of these other things, where our children can play safely and grow up healthy. And so the alternative to incarceration is making sure that Black and brown communities have equal opportunities to grow up in neighborhoods where they can thrive. And right now, the system is stacked against us. And so we need to, again, change so many things in our community, but that comes with moving resources into our community. And as, a prison abolitionist, we need to tear down prisons, dismantle prisons, close prisons, and use those billions of dollars to make healthy, strong communities. Because that's where it starts.
Thank you. And we're almost out of time. We've had a few folks ask for resources though. So maybe if each of you can take a moment to point folks to a book or an article that can provide like statistics. There's a lot of interest from folks to tell people about this, right? To spread the word. So we want to make it as easy as possible for them.
So I would suggest Miriam Kaba. Her website, transformharm.org, is amazing. There's so many resources there. Transformharm.org.
I was going to suggest the same thing, including her new book, We Do This Till We Free Us.
Yes.
Which my 2-year-old and I saw in a bookstore the other day, and he pointed it and said Auntie's book. And I was like, correct. Recognized it from the several places it sits in our home. But I think it's just it's a visionary and practical tool. And then also would say our website, commonjustice.org, has a lot. If you're looking for really specific examples of ways in which violence is addressed without prison, our work is sort of built not only to serve where we serve, but to serve as an example for others to leverage wherever they are. So that's a good place as well. Yeah, and then Interrupting Criminalization is another really good website and sort of confluence of resources around these things.
I would definitely echo those recommendations. And, Mariam Kaba's website is wonderful. It's a great set of resources, really. And I know we're about out of time, but I just note that for our work, I've come to kind of the same places that Danielle and Romarilyn have come to, but come to it just through my proximity and a commitment to understanding the folks who were caught in this process and how they got there and how we failed them, frankly, as a society. I mean, we failed to protect them from the harms that you all have been describing. And that really what we should be working on it's not focusing on less policing, but more of a lot of other things, other kind of opportunities and housing and food and access to medical and mental health care and thrivable wages, for example, creating those conditions that are antithetical to violence instead of feeding this machine that only produces violence and more harm. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with and hear from both of you today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Carlos and to Annie on our team who helped put this whole series together. We should do much more of this, but also have it be focused on how do we make this stuff practical? Because we can talk to each other all day, but we really want to see folks come home, and we want to replace this system with something that actually works. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Carlos, anything else before we close out?
No, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Keith, I already have some ideas, so I'll be in touch with you and Annie about it. But thank you. And, specifically for the Change Lawyers audience, it's a lot of lawyers in the room and a lot of folks who have worked inside of the system. So to hear perspective of activists and people pushing to change and dismantle the system, it's a struggle hearing a lot of this, but it's necessary. So thank you for everything that you all do and for your time.
Thank you both.
Take care. All right, folks, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be providing the recording as well as some resources that Danielle and Romarilyn mentioned in a follow-up email. And also stay tuned for more emails from Change Lawyers. So if you see my name in your inbox, we're about to launch a special Pride Month event series that's going to focus on how we can show up for our queer and gender nonconforming family. So thanks so much and take care.